September 25th, 1780, in a colonial home south of Garrison, New York, on the eastern side of the Hudson River. George Washington, the giant muscular Virginian, general at the head of the Continental armies, arriving. He's just come from West Point, a fort placed at a crucial bend that protects the Hudson River, which he found to be disgustingly under-fortified. He was hoping to meet with an old friend who he recently placed in command of the fort, but is finding him absent. The general is handed some documents from a messenger, which is when the usually stoic general's countenance slips. The papers in his hands come from a recently captured British spy, John Andre. They reveal one of the greatest threats to American independence, involving his dear friend, Benedict Arnold. "Who can we trust now?" the commander says to the Marquis de Lafayette, a member of his inner circle. Tomorrow, Washington will write in his general orders, "Treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered." Benedict Arnold, to Americans in the decades following the Revolution, is a name synonymous with backstabbing, betrayal, deceit, indignity, and even Satan himself. Today, though, historians have moved past the emotions that played a part in Arnold's story and see a complicated man who served America with bravery and was willing to sacrifice much for a nation that at the time was only a concept. But the political selfishness of the Continental Congress and other generals fought against Arnold repeatedly and left him feeling cheated. Eventually, this would be too much for Arnold, and instead of America cheating him, he would cheat America. Benedict Arnold was born January 14, 1741, in Norwich, Connecticut, to Benedict Arnold Sr. and Hannah Waterman King. The family was initially wealthy, but poor business deals soured this silver spoon life. On top of this, a yellow fever outbreak would take 3 of Arnold's siblings. The financial issues of his family forced Arnold to withdraw from school and seek an apprenticeship as an apothecary under his cousins. At the same time, the French and Indian War broke out, in which Arnold served in the Connecticut militia at the age of 14. Arnold would desert the militia in order to care for his sickly mother. By 18, Arnold would lose his mother, and at 20, his father would follow her. At this point, his only surviving family member would be one sister out of 5 siblings. They would become business partners for Arnold's own apothecary. At this point, Arnold would take on colonial New England's favorite pastime: smuggling. In 1767, Arnold married Margaret Mansfield, who he had 3 sons with. Before Arnold was known to history, he was already cheated from an easy life with an education. Arnold would be forced to fight for what he felt he already deserved. With the rising tensions in colonial Boston, Arnold would again join the militia, in which he became a captain on the governor's 2nd Company of Guards. After the War for Independence started in the towns of Lexington and Concord, Arnold would receive orders from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety to lead a campaign to capture Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. Arnold met with Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, numbering around 150 to 200 men. But Allen rejected the orders for Arnold to lead his militia, and the two were stuck in an awkward duality of command, of which Allen would still have the loyalty of the men for the rest of the campaign. Fort Ticonderoga was taken easily on May 10, 1775, with only a single man wounded and 1 captured earlier, while the British garrison was surprised and captured entirely. The guns captured at the fort would be famously moved by Bostonian librarian Henry Knox, the future First Secretary of War, to Dorchester Heights, south of Boston, forcing the British army besieged there to evacuate. After the fall of the fort, Colonel James Eaton, the man delivering the message of the fort's capture to Massachusetts, shorted Arnold's involvement in the campaign. At the same time, Jonathan Trumbull, governor of Connecticut, sent Colonel Benjamin Hinman to command the fort. Allen would accept this, relinquishing his command, but Arnold would not. and threatened a treasonous act of handing 2 ships over to the British. Hinman would win over Arnold's soldiers, take control of the ships mentioned by Arnold, and dissolved his command entirely. Arnold would then leave to Albany feeling cheated and scornful of his fellow patriots. It's possible that the politics between Connecticut and Massachusetts played a role in Arnold's lack of glory for his efforts in the campaign, with the states both playing for the fame of taking the first offensive action of the war. Only a month after the fort fell, Arnold's wife would die, and Arnold's own health would be challenged by gout. Moving forward, Arnold's plans for an invasion of Canada were accepted by George Washington, who proposed to Congress that Arnold would participate under the command of Philip Schuyler. Arnold and his men moved north in September, but a letter Arnold wrote to Quebecois resident John Dyer Mercier, who he hoped would give him intelligence on the city's defenses, would fall into British hands. By late December, the revolutionaries arrived at Quebec with 600 men, then being reinforced by Richard Montgomery and his 300 men, after they had captured Montreal. On December 31st, the attack began. No progress was being made, and General Montgomery was killed, with Arnold being shot in his leg. Arnold refused to surrender and still gave orders from his bed. Arnold was forced to retreat to Montreal. In the meantime, he agreed to a prisoner exchange of 500 Americans captured at a nearby battle. With the Canadian populace largely against the revolution, the Americans were forced to give up their hopes of a 14th colony and retreated back to New England. The campaign was a disaster, but not to the faults of Arnold, who was wounded in his service and promoted to brigadier general. Through the rest of 1776, Arnold would be on the defensive in courtrooms instead of the battlefield. Through many accusations against his campaign and capabilities, Arnold was constantly involved in a war of attritionary law. Around the same time, Colonel John Brown, who served with Arnold at Ticonderoga, would claim, "Money is this man's god," and to get enough of it, he would sacrifice his country. But this claim would not stir any feelings until after the infamous day. Many of the officers under him were also made major generals, while Arnold remained at his rank of brigadier general. Washington would come to his defense many times, and writing to Richard Henry Lee in April of 1777, "As a piece of justice due to, and to prevent the loss of, so good an officer, I could wish to see Arnold promoted to the rank of major general, and put in his proper place. It is by men of his activity and spirit the cause is to be supported, and not by Heath, Spencer, and Co." Arnold would travel to Philadelphia for answers, and on the way would harass a British force 3 times the size of his own, inflicting twice as many casualties in the Battle of Ridgefield. For this, he would receive the promotion he felt he had deserved for so long in advance. Except being promoted after many of his own subordinates to Major General, he was now a subordinate to them. Congress refused to grant his seniority, which only added to Arnold's belief that he resided in George Washington in a March 11, 1777 letter. "Their promoting junior officers to the rank of major generals I view as a very civil way of requesting my resignation, as unqualified for the office I hold." In July, Arnold would resign, but quickly backstep once learning of George Washington's letter to Congressional President John Hancock recommending Arnold to serve again under Schuyler. Back in the driver's seat, Arnold would again prove his gallantry. In the siege of Fort Stanwix, he successfully fooled the British into believing thousands of Americans were coming to relieve the fort, while less than 1,000 were actually under his command. The British completely abandoned their siege. Then, at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, Arnold disobeyed orders from General Gates, leaving the fort to fight the British. Gates would then censor his reports of any news of Arnold's valor. After arguments about what troops Arnold commanded, Gates relieved him of command. Arnold stayed with the army nevertheless, and at the Battle of Bemis Heights, with no official command, he would rally troops and break the British center, with himself at the front of these men. The British lines collapsed, with many crediting Arnold as being the greatest effect on American victory. At the end of the battle, Arnold's horse would be shot out from under him, falling on top of the same leg that was shot last December at Quebec. Arnold would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but in part from his sacrifice, British General Burgoyne would surrender 10 days later at Saratoga, giving France the confidence to join the war on the American side, and ultimately being the single most influential campaign in the American Revolutionary War. Arnold finally received his much-anticipated seniority, but it was far too late for him. He now spent the winter at Valley Forge with the army, and when the British evacuated Philadelphia, Washington made him commander of the city. While here, he met Peggy Shippen, who he would marry on April 8, 1779 at age 19, while he was 38. Peggy was a loyalist woman, outspoken about her political views, especially for an 18th century upper-class woman. She was part of the Philadelphia elites who enjoyed the social circles of the British during their occupation, which is where she met Major John Andre. During his stay in Philadelphia, Arnold would live extravagantly, but would commit to underhand dealings to afford it. He was court-martialed in June of 1779, defending himself, but ultimately being found guilty on the charges of using government wagons for personal use and issuing a pass to a ship he would later invest in. George Washington would recommend Arnold to publicly declare that his actions were imprudent and improper. It's around this time that Arnold is finally sickened enough by the slights against him that he commits to treason against the United States of America. He writes to Washington on May 5, 1779 that, having made every sacrifice of fortune and blood, and become a cripple in the service of my country, I little expected to meet the ungrateful returns I have received of my countrymen, but as Congress have stamped ingratitude as a current coin, I must take it. Corresponding with Andre, Arnold would offer up West Point in return for £10,000 and a high-level commission in the British Army. Arnold requested command of West Point, which Washington granted in his letter of August 3, 1780. Arnold would correspond with Andre throughout this time, until, on the morning of September 26th, Andre would be arrested, and incriminating documents found on his person would be immediately sent to Washington, soon to arrive at the Robinson House, where he would be having breakfast with Benedict Arnold. First to arrive to Arnold was Lieutenant Allen, with news of a British spy, John Anderson, captured nearby, while declaring that the documents on the spy would be sent to Washington, soon to arrive. Arnold would remain a moment, but excused himself to talk to his wife. Then, coming back downstairs, he would let his guests know he had some business to attend to at the fort, and would be back for dinner with Washington and his entourage. Arnold's world was closing in on all sides, as in only an hour, Washington would arrive, he would be arrested, and hanged dishonorably as a traitor. Arnold mounted his horse and rode down to a barge. Back in this colonial home, on the other side of the river from West Point, where we began this story, the General-in-Chief, papers still in hand, immediately orders Arnold's arrest, but it's too late. Arnold has already ordered his crew to take him to the HMS Vulture. Suddenly, Peggy Shippen shrieks from upstairs. Colonel Richard Varick barges into her room, seeing her, disheveled and flowing about her neck, in her morning gown with few other clothes remaining on her, too few to be seen even by a gentleman of the family, much less by many strangers. She then proceeded to ask if he had ordered her child to be killed, and to spare her innocent babe. After a few moments of shrieks and sobs, Peggy would point at the ceiling and say, "The spirits have carried him up there. They have put hot irons on his head." After this, Peggy screamed, stating she had hot irons on her head, that only George Washington could remove. Washington was brought upstairs, but Peggy believed he was an impostor of the general. Peggy was left alone for the rest of the day until she regained herself. By this point, Arnold wrote a letter from the Vulture to Washington, wishing for the safe passage of his wife. Peggy was known for anxiety and panic, but also for using these to impose a sense of weakness to others for her own gain. Peggy, with her strong political beliefs, her knowledge of her husband's contacts with John Andre and his betrayal, more likely played the part of a hysterical damsel to buy time for Arnold to escape. Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette, and George Washington were all fooled by Peggy and aimed their hatred entirely at Benedict Arnold, not only for the betrayal of his country, but the perceived betrayal and mental breakdown of his wife. Hamilton wrote in a letter to his wife Eliza, daughter of Philip Schuyler, "Her sufferings were so eloquent that I wished myself her brother, to have a right to become her defender. As it is, I have entreated her to enable me to give her proofs of my friendship." Aboard the Vulture, Arnold would write to Washington, still signing his letters as "Your Excellency's most obedient, humble servant, B. Arnold." He would request the safe and respectful transportation of his wife to him, claiming all fault should lie on him, and that she was innocent and incapable of doing wrong. Washington, a gentleman believing that women were not valid targets of war, would do so without response. John Andre, captured, was due to be hanged as a spy, a dishonorable execution for a dishonorable form of war that both sides participated in vigorously. But Andre was so beloved by not only the British but even his American captors that some believe Washington even sought his pardon. Andre's final request to Washington was to be executed by firing squad, a form of execution that was reserved for honorable men. However, on October 2nd, he was led to the gallows where he died stoically. The site of his hanging received a monument, now in the town of Tappan, New York. It states, among other things about John, though according to the stern code of war, moved even his enemies to pity, and both armies mourned the fate of one so young and brave. In 1821, his remains were moved to Westminster Abbey, where his monument there reads again about John, universally beloved and esteemed by the army in which he serves, and lamented even by his foes. From here, Arnold's life is more obscure, as he was despised by Americans and untrusted by the British, who now saw him as a man who would betray his country for money. In early 1781, Arnold went to Virginia, where he raided and burned Richmond, the capital. Then in September, he would raid his own homeland of Connecticut, where he captured a privateer base in New London, privateers being government-issued pirates, but at the cost of a 25% casualty rate of a nearly 2,000-man army. But from here, his military ventures cease, as does the majority of the fighting of the American Revolution after the fall of Yorktown on October 19th of 1781. Benedict and Peggy would move to London, where he couldn't find work, and was generally ignored by the British. He was awarded around £6,000 with a mediocre pension. In 1786, he moved to St. John, Canada, finding the atmosphere to be about the same. And in 1791, moving back to London, living in obscurity, where he resided until his death in 1801 from gout. Saratoga, New York, the site of the Revolution's most influential battle, houses a 155-foot tall obelisk. With 4 sides, each holds a place for the heroes of the battle. General Philip Schuyler looks to the east, Colonel Daniel Morgan faces west, and General Horatio Gates to the north. But the southern side of the obelisk is barren, holding the place of a hero of the American Revolution whose name is synonymous with traitor.